Republican presidential candidate Bobby Jindal continues to embarrass himself in an effort to, of course, pander for votes. Now, in an interview on Sunday with CNN host Martha Raddatz, Bobby Jindal showed just how much he doesn't know about what's going on in the world. Watch.
I want to turn to the 2016 race and your race, where you stand on certain issues. You were a supporter of training Syrian rebels. That has been a complete failure. They're not going to do that anymore. The Obama administration said essentially that it wasn't working. So what would work?
Well, Martha, look, bad policy, bad leadership leads to bad options. The reality is they waited so long that we've got fewer good options. If they had aggressively trained those rebels in the beginning, if they had armed and trained the Kurds, we'd be in a different place. You wouldn't have Putin and Assad working with Hezbollah and Iran. What will work today is we do need to train
how do you train rebels who were there to fight Assad to suddenly want to fight ISIS? That's the main problem with those Syrian rebels.
Well, no, Martha, the Kurdish rebels, the Kurdish forces have been very effective at fighting ISIS in Kobani, in Iraq, and elsewhere, but we're not providing them with modern arms. We're insisting on going through the Baghdad government. So the Kurds have been a very effective force. Secondly, we need to enforce that no-fly. We need to create a no-fly zone working with our Turkish and other allies. Our Sunni allies want to do more, but they're not going to go after ISIS if that merely leaves Assad in power. They don't want Assad in power.
Let's talk about a no-fly zone. ISIS doesn't have aircraft, so what would that no-fly zone really accomplish? When does it really work?
Well, it accomplishes a couple of things. It accomplishes a couple of things, Martha. One, it helps to stabilize the region so you don't have all these refugees flooding into Europe and trying to leave the country. Secondly, it gives us space for moderates, for Kurds and others to group and to plan attacks against ISIS, against Assad. Third, it keeps Russia from bombing our allies, the folks that we're working with. It also shows our Sunni allies in the region that we're serious about winning this.
Wow, Bobby Jindal's dumb. He wants a no-fly zone. But ISIS doesn't have an air force. They don't even have any aircraft. How'd that even work? We're already bombing targets on the ground, so yeah, there are places where our allies, so-called allies in the region, can gather. It makes no sense. How exactly does us flying around with our thumbs up our asses gonna do but waste money and time? Our pilots could actually, instead of patrolling a so-called no-fly zone, they could actually be engaging ISIS targets on the ground elsewhere. Doesn't make any sense. Now, on arming the Kurds. Now, these are just facts, okay? This is very tricky when it comes to arming the Kurds. The Kurds are fighting ISIS, which is great. Now, you would ask, why don't we help them? Why don't we arm the Kurds? As Bobby Jindal asked, he's like, why don't we? They're very effective. That's very true. That is very effective. But it gets a little complicated because of regional politics. Now here's where Bobby Jindal has no understanding of nuance or politics within the region. Now, Turkey has designated the Kurdish PKK, the majority of people that are fighting in the area, and by the way, the PKK is a Marxist organization. So here's Bobby Jindal saying, let's give Marxists guns. Let that irony sink in for just a second here. Now, Turkey considers the PKK a terrorist group, right? And Turkey just recently started bombing them as well. It was a couple of weeks ago that Turkey said, okay, we're gonna join your fight on ISIS, but we're also gonna bomb the Kurds because we do not want an independent Kurdistan in northern Syria on our border. We won't have it. That's one of the goals of the PKK, is to get their own Kurdish territory. So now there's that. Now, why do we care? Why do we give a fuck? Why don't we just arm the Kurds anyway? Well, we can't, because it turns out that Turkey is actually one of our allies in the region. They're also part of NATO. So when I say ally, we have 2 military bases in Turkey right now that we're actually using as a staging area to bomb ISIS targets. Now, those military bases are there for a reason. We kind of use those. They're kind of instrumental in our attacks against the Islamic State. If we want to keep those open, well, we can't just go arm the Kurds. Basically, what it comes down to is if we do arm the Kurds, when it comes to Turkey, we become sponsors of terrorism. You know, we go after countries all the time. You're a state sponsor of terrorism. Well, if we start giving the PKK arms, aren't we becoming sponsors of terrorism? And that's the whole reason why I don't like the word terrorism in most contexts, because states will just use it willy-nilly since that's what we did. Now, if we don't, however, if we don't arm the Kurds, well, we could lose a potential ally in the fight against ISIS. In fact, they've already been helping us. Elements related to the PKK have been giving coalition and American commanders vital intelligence on ISIS movements and have done a lot to help stop the advance of Islamic State fighters in the area. So as I said, this is really nuanced. This is really complicated. And you can't just ignore that. You can't just ignore the nuance. And you can't ignore the regional politics of the area. You have to take that into account if you're going to do something. And see, that's one of the reasons Iraq is such a mess today. Our politicians thought that all the different sects and the different religious and ethnic groups would start working together magically for some reason, after hundreds of years of animosity. It didn't quite work that way. Instead, what we did is that we blindly went in there with assumptions, made a mess of the area, opened the Pandora's box, and ISIS popped out. Now, it appears that from this interview, Bobby Jindal hasn't learned a thing about this. He hasn't learned the lesson of Iraq. And he can't wait to open the next box to see what other kind of horrible things come out.